You finally arrived. So why does it feel like you lost everything? Carl Jung mapped why the end of a spiritual awakening feels like losing everything. He called it deflation. And what dies in it is not what you think. Your life cracked open. The clock whispered. Strangers felt like signs. Now the fire is out, and the silence feels like something alive in you was buried. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what died. You will understand why the synchronicities stopped, and why their silence is not abandonment. You will understand who you actually became during the awakening, and why that self had to die. You will understand the moment the seeker is meant to lie down, and why almost no one lets it. Because you are standing in an ordinary Tuesday that feels like a grave you are lying in with your eyes open, grieving something you had no permission to grieve. And what you buried was never the awakening. It was the one who needed the awakening to feel chosen. By the end, you will know whether the quiet is your death or the first thing in years that was ever yours. You keep waiting to feel like you arrived somewhere, but the quiet is not a destination. It is the sound of something inside you that has stopped breathing. You already know a smaller version of this feeling. The morning after the wedding, you spent a year planning. The Monday after the trip, you saved 2 years for. That strange, hollow flatness that arrives the day after you finally get the thing you wanted, when the striving stops and a silence rushes in to fill the space the wanting used to occupy. You expected to feel full. Instead, you felt emptied. Now take that quiet letdown and stretch it across your entire sense of who you are. That is the ground you are standing on. For years, your life was cracked open in ways you could not explain to anyone. The numbers on the clock felt like messages. Every stranger seemed to hand you the exact right piece of wisdom at the exact moment you needed it. You felt, for the first time in your life, like you were becoming who you were supposed to be. There was an electricity to your ordinary days, a sense that something enormous was moving through you, arranging things, waking you up. But lately that charge has vanished. You are standing in an ordinary Tuesday, and it does not feel like enlightenment. It feels like you lost the most important thing that ever happened to you. And nobody warned you that completion might look like a barren plain. So you do what anyone would do. You go looking for the fire, you reach for the books that used to crack you open, and they read like instructions for a machine you no longer own. You wait for the signs to return. You wonder if you did something wrong. If you let the awakening slip through your fingers. If the version of you that was so alive, so chosen, so close to the truth, has quietly died and left you here, standing in a life that feels like a room someone has already moved out of. You have started to wonder if you made it all up. The doubt arrives quietly, usually late, when the house is still. You think back to the months when every day felt like a revelation, and from this gray vantage point, they look almost embarrassing, like the diary of someone you used to be and can no longer fully recognize. You miss that person. You miss the one who woke before dawn, certain the universe was speaking directly to them, the one who could not stop reading, the one who felt the whole sky leaning in to watch. And you cannot decide whether that person was closer to the truth than you are now, or whether they were simply further from the ground. What frightens you most is that you cannot name what you are feeling. It is not sadness exactly. Sadness has a shape, an object, a reason. This has none. It is a flatness that you cannot distinguish from numbness, a calm you cannot tell apart from deadness. You sit in it and you wait for it to resolve into something you can recognize, and it refuses. And in the silence, the old fear surfaces, that you wasted years of your life chasing something that was never real, that the magic was a story you told yourself to survive a season you no longer remember the shape of. And this is where the real danger sits. Misreading this quiet will cost you everything. If you read this flatness as a relapse, you will spend years hunting the old fire, manufacturing spiritual crises just to feel awake again. If you read it as a failure, You will refuse to grieve, and you will freeze yourself into a permanent seeker who can never ever arrive. You will keep the wound open on purpose, because the wound was the only thing that ever made you feel like you were going somewhere. Jung did not treat this silence the way a mystic would. He treated it as a clinician who watched it happen to his patients and then watched it happen to himself. So before we go down into it, sit with one possibility. What if the emptiness is not the awakening breaking down? What if it is the awakening finishing its actual work? We are going to walk through 3 movements. First, what actually ended when the fire went out, because it is not what you think you are grieving. Second, the exact Jungian mechanism that makes its death feel like losing everything, the part Jung found genuinely dangerous. And third, the one thing Jung understood about what is left when the seeker is finally gone, the single realization that turns this entire loss inside out. If you stay for nothing else, stay for the third movement. It is the part that decides whether the rest of your life is spent mourning the heights or standing on the ground they were always clearing for you. Stay with the discomfort of this. The naming is going to be precise, and precision is not always gentle. You believe you are grieving the loss of your awakening. You are not. You are grieving the death of the seeker. The seeker was the heightened, hungry, special self you had to become in order to survive the crossing. Think about who you became in those years. You read until the sky went pale. You collected insights like a person starving. You built an entire identity around perpetual self-improvement, around the community of the awake, around being someone who could see what the sleeping people around you could not. The seeker was magnificent. The seeker was also a survival mechanism wearing sacred language. Jung had a clinical name for the state you were in. He called it inflation. When the ego touches the numinous contents of the unconscious, the vast, ancient material that lives beneath ordinary awareness, it does not simply observe them. It identifies with them. It absorbs them. It puffs up. Jung described inflation as an expansion of the personality beyond its proper limits, an identification with an archetype or with the contents of the deeper psyche that produces an exaggerated sense of one's own importance. In his words, it causes a puffed-up attitude, a loss of free will, and an enthusiasm that runs through good and evil alike. Read that slowly because it names something you have not let yourself look at directly. The specialness you felt during your awakening was not a higher frequency. It was the ego wearing sacred language. You touched something real. Something genuinely sacred moved through you. But the part of you that said, "Look how far I have come, look how much I see, look how chosen I am," that part was not enlightenment. That part was the oldest trick the ego knows. It dressed itself in the robes of the sacred and called itself your soul. The ego mistook the experience of the self for the achievement of it. It stood in the doorway of something vast and announced that it had built the house. And notice how seductive that was. The awakening did not feel like inflation from the inside. From the inside, it felt like truth. It felt like finally seeing clearly after a lifetime of being asleep. Every insight confirmed it. Every synchronicity confirmed it. Every conversation in which you understood something the other person could not see confirmed it. The inflation built its own evidence, because that is what inflation does. It recruits the whole world to testify on its behalf. And the lonelier and more misunderstood you felt, the more it whispered that you were simply too far ahead for the people around you to follow. You have probably met the clearest example of this. The man at the center of the group who has read everything, who has a framework for your pain before you have finished describing it, who talks about his own awakening in the calm, level voice of someone reporting from a higher altitude. People defer to him. He is not a fraud. He has genuinely seen something real. But watch him long enough, and you notice he can no longer have an ordinary conversation. Every exchange becomes a teaching. Every silence becomes a lesson he is quietly holding for you. That is inflation with a face. And the reason it is almost impossible to catch in yourself is that, from the inside, it does not feel like ego. It feels exactly like depth. Here is what stings. The community of the awake, the people who understood the language, the sense of belonging to something rare. A great deal of that belonging was built on a shared inflation, a mutual agreement to confirm one another's specialness. It was real comfort, but it rested on a wound, not on ground. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of your grief. The intensity you missed so badly was, in large part, a psyche in crisis. The electricity, the urgency, the sense that everything mattered enormously, that is the signature of a self under pressure, a self being reorganized, a self that had not yet found its ground. The version of you that you are mourning was not your highest self. It was a symptom, a beautiful, necessary, temporary symptom of a transformation that had not yet completed. And this changes what the grief actually is. You are not standing over the corpse of the magic. You are standing over the corpse of the one who needed the magic. You did not lose the light. You stopped being the kind of wound that mistakes its own bleeding for light. Sit with that for a moment, because it is a hard thing to be told. The aliveness you are nostalgic for had a cost you were not counting. It cost you peace. It cost you the ability to simply be in a room without scanning it for signs. It cost you the ordinary, and you called the ordinary unconsciousness because the seeker could not survive in a world that was not constantly confirming its importance. But if the seeker was inflation, then what comes next is the part Jung found genuinely dangerous, the part almost no one survives intact. It is a Tuesday afternoon. You glance at the clock and see 333. A year ago, that string of numbers would have sent a rush of confirmation through your chest, a signal, a wink from the universe, proof you were on the path. Today, it is just the time. You put on the playlist that used to crack your soul open, and it is just music, playing in a room while you fold laundry. The signs have stopped feeling like signs. The world that was once saturated with meaning, where everything pointed to something, has gone completely flat. The friendships you built on mutual seeking have thinned out, leaving a stable, heavy solitude you do not know what to do with. You wonder if you imagined all of it. You wonder if you fell back asleep. You did not fall back asleep. Something far more important happened, and Jung named it precisely. This is the necessary deflation. Jung taught that the descent must follow the ascent, that this is one of the deepest laws of the psyche. He learned it from Heraclitus, who called it enantiodromia, a running contrariwise, the principle by which everything, sooner or later, runs into its opposite. An extreme one-sidedness in the psyche cannot hold. The dizzying heights, the charged synchronicities, the constant electric meaning, all of it had to swing into its contrary. It had to end in a flat, unglamorous plane. This reversal is not a punishment. It is not a relapse into unconsciousness. It is the correction. It is the psyche grounding itself, pulling the expanded self back down out of the thin air where nothing real can live, and planting it in the only soil where a life can actually be built, the earth. And here is the mechanism behind the silence of the world. Jung wrote that the supreme aim of the inner work is conscious realization, and that the first step is to make oneself conscious of contents that have until now been projected outward. Projection. That is the word. The psyche, when it is overflowing with unintegrated material, paints its own contents onto the outside world, and then reads them back as messages. The wound inside you needed the universe to speak, so the universe spoke. The crisis inside you needed the clock to confirm you were chosen, so the clock confirmed it. The synchronicities were real experiences, but the engine driving them was your own unconscious, pressing its contents onto every surface it could find, because it had nowhere else to put them yet. So when the world went quiet, it did not abandon you. You simply stopped projecting your inner crisis onto it. The synchronicities did not stop because you fell asleep again. They stopped because you no longer needed the universe to whisper that you were going to be all right. The meaning withdrew back into its source, into you. The world is not less alive now. You are simply no longer feeding it from a wound. Let yourself feel how strange this loss is, because it is a loss, even if it is the right one. For years, the world answered you. The clock answered. The song answered. The stranger in line answered with the exact sentence you needed to hear. To live inside a world that constantly speaks to you is to never be alone, even in your isolation. And now that voice has fallen silent, and the silence feels like abandonment. Even though nothing has abandoned you, you have simply stopped hearing your own unconscious echoed back through the furniture of the world. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, because I read every response to these. This silence has already taken something from you. A synchronicity you miss, a certainty you used to wear, a version of yourself you can no longer find. Name that one thing in the comments. Just the single thing you have not been able to say out loud to anyone. Putting it into language is where the grieving quietly begins. Then stay with me, because this quiet is about to take something more intimate than the synchronicities, and then it is going to make you choose. The friendships go quiet in the same way. The ones built on mutual seeking, on the shared electricity of the journey, thin out almost imperceptibly. There is no fight, no rupture. There is just less to say. The conversations that once felt like communion now feel like a language you used to be fluent in and have started to forget. You are not better than those people. You have simply walked out of the shared fever, and you cannot pretend to still have it. What remains is a stable, heavy solitude that you do not yet know how to read. It feels like punishment. Jung would tell you it is the precondition for everything real that comes next, and you have told no one. That is the part that isolates you most. Not the silence itself, but the fact that you cannot say out loud that you are grieving your own healing, because every voice in the spiritual world insists that arrival is supposed to feel like joy. So you carry it in private, half convinced that something is wrong with you for mourning the very thing you once begged for. Hear this clearly, because almost no one will say it to you. You are not the only one standing in this exact silence. You are simply one of the few honest enough to call it grief instead of pretending it is peace. Jung knew this silence personally. After he broke from Freud and walked away from the academic career that had defined him, he entered years of profound isolation. He wrote that the consequence of his resolve was an extreme loneliness. He went about laden with thoughts he could speak to no one, thoughts that would only have been misunderstood. He said he felt the gulf between the external world and the interior world of images in its most painful form. This was not a footnote in his life. This was the man who mapped the unconscious, describing the exact flat, unglamorous, lonely aftermath you are standing in right now. He did not call it failure. He stood in the gap, and the gap is where the real work began. This is the place that splits people permanently into two kinds of person, and which one you become has nothing to do with how awakened you were. It has everything to do with what you do with this silence. What do you do when the project of fixing yourself suddenly runs out of material? That is the real question at this stage. For years, you had infinite work to do, shadows to integrate, wounds to heal, patterns to break, higher selves to reach, and then one day the material thins out. The deflation arrives, and you stand at a fork that determines the rest of your inner life. One path refuses the deflation. On this path, you cling to the seeker. You manufacture the next crisis, the next breakthrough, the next dark night, the next level. You stay always on a journey. You become someone who is perpetually awakening, because the alternative, arriving, is unbearable. Arriving means the specialness ends. Arriving means you are just a person, living an ordinary life, like everyone you once quietly believed you had surpassed. Jung had a name for what captures you on this path. He called it the mana personality. When the ego refuses to deflate, it seizes the energy of the transformation and wears it as a permanent costume. It becomes the one who knows, the one who has seen. The spiritual persona hardens into a mask that can never come off, because the person underneath is terrified of what they are without it. Endless seeking is the most sophisticated form of avoidance there is. The person who is forever awakening is not deeper than the person who stopped. They are more afraid. They have found a way to make their fear of ordinary life look like devotion. They have turned running from a rival into a spiritual achievement, and the mask is comfortable. That is what makes it so dangerous. The mana personality is rewarded everywhere it goes. People defer to the one who knows. They ask for guidance. They confirm the specialness, the same way the synchronicities once did. So the inflated self gets fed indefinitely by an audience that mistakes its costume for depth. There is always another teaching to consume, another modality, another level, another dark night to perform. And each one postpones the single thing the psyche is actually asking for: to come down, to be ordinary, to stop. Think of the friend who has been on the verge of a breakthrough for 9 years. Last spring it was breathwork. Before that, a teacher abroad. Before that, the silent retreats, the somatic work, the medicine ceremonies, the new diet that was somehow also a spiritual path. Every few months there is a new doorway, a new almost, a new vocabulary for the same restlessness. You love them. And somewhere underneath the love is a question you have never said out loud. When does the searching stop being the road they are traveling and quietly become the house they have decided to live in? You have never asked them, because lately in the silence of your own ordinary Tuesdays, you have started to wonder the same thing about yourself. You can recognize this fork in your own thinking. Listen for the voice that says you have not arrived yet, you are still on the journey, there is more to unlock, the work is never finished. Sometimes that voice is honest, and sometimes it is the seeker, terrified, refusing to let the deflation land, because if the journey ever ended, it would have to face the plain and unglamorous fact of being a person like any other, in a life like any other, with no special vantage and no cosmic role. The seeker would rather stay wounded forever than admit the wound has closed, because the wound was the only thing that ever made it feel chosen. The other path honestly grieves. On this path, you let the seeker die. You mourn the loss of the specialness fully and without flinching. You admit that you miss feeling chosen. You admit that the ordinary frightens you. You let yourself feel the genuine bereavement of watching the most alive years of your life recede behind you. And you do not reach for the shovel. You let the body stay in the ground. This is the harder path. And there is a reason it is harder, and it has nothing to do with willpower. Jung understood that to let the inflated self go is to surrender the ego's claim to being the center of everything. It is to accept that you are not the hero of a cosmic story. It is to let yourself be small. And the ego will fight that with everything it has, because to the ego, small feels like death. So it keeps one hand permanently on the old wound, refusing to let it close, because an open wound still points somewhere, still implies a journey, still insists that you are owed a return to the heights. The forever seeker is not grieving. The forever seeker is bargaining, and the currency is your remaining years. The honest grief asks for something the inflation never did. It asks you to be a human being, ordinary, unchosen, and real. Imagine you finally set down a heavy pack you strapped on the day the awakening began, and have not taken off since. The relief is not triumphant, it is quiet. Your shoulders rise without the weight, and for a moment your hands do not know what to do with the lightness. What remains after the deflation is not an exalted self. It is smaller, quieter, and for the first time in years, it is not performing its own depth. It is not scanning the room for signs. It is not narrating its own transformation. It is just here, in an ordinary life, being a person who has stopped needing to be extraordinary. Jung would tell you that this was always the destination. The goal of individuation, the long work of becoming whole, was never a permanent high. It was never the synchronicities, or the electricity, or the feeling of being chosen. It was the relocation of the psyche's center, away from the ego toward the self. The self is the true center, the one that includes the unconscious, the one that does not need applause or signs or confirmation to know that it exists. Jung wrote that the self does not become conscious by itself, but is something we are taught slowly, through a tradition of knowing, through the patient descent into our own depths and the long climb back. The ego's deflation is what allows the self to take its rightful quiet seat. The one who was searching had to step down so the one who simply is could finally sit at the center. This is not a consolation prize. This is the thing the whole awakening was for. So hear this clearly. You did not lose everything. You lost the one who needed everything. The ordinary life you are standing in, the one that feels so flat, so unremarkable, so quiet, is the exact ground the awakening was clearing the whole time. The signs went silent so that you could finally hear something quieter underneath them. The fire went out so that you could finally feel the warmth of something that does not need to burn and notice what becomes possible only now. With the seeker gone, you can love a person without turning them into a teacher. You can sit in a room without auditing it for meaning. You can do the dishes and have it be the dishes. The constant translation has stopped. The endless conversion of every moment into a sign or a lesson or a stage of the journey. What is left is contact. Direct, unglamorous, unmediated contact with your own life, which the seeker was always too busy interpreting to actually touch. Jung did not promise you a permanent high on the far side of individuation. He promised you something the inflated self could never hold. A center that does not move when the room stops applauding. What dies at the end of an awakening is the part of you that was awakening. What is left does not glow. It simply finally stays. This quiet was never the failure you took it for. It is the sound of the one who could not stop searching finally lying down. That stillness is not death. It is the first thing in years that is actually yours, because it is not borrowed from a sign or a synchronicity or the flattering certainty that you were ahead of everyone else. You spent the awakening certain that the meaning was out there, waiting to be found. The deflation taught you the truth the seeker could never accept. The meaning was never out there. It was the thing doing the looking. And it has finally come home and sat down in an ordinary life on an ordinary evening and called it enough. If a grief you were never given room to feel just surfaced while you listened, tell me below. What did you lose at the end of your awakening that no one ever let you mourn?
Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com.